So, to understand why axis of evil became one of the most controversial phrases in modern presidential rhetoric, you need to know three things. First, the phrase was deliberately designed to cast the post-9/11 era as a new global struggle between good and evil. David Frum, a Canadian-born speechwriter, was asked to find a way to link Iraq to the war on terror for the upcoming State of the Union. His first draft used axis of hatred to group Iraq with Iran and North Korea. Chief speechwriter Michael Gerson changed hatred to evil, a word with profound moral and religious connotations that Bush, a born-again Christian, used frequently.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
It's January 29th, 2002, the House Chamber, the U.S. Capitol. 4.5 months after 9/11. George W. Bush stands before a joint session of Congress and tens of millions of television viewers to deliver his first State of the Union address since the terrorist attacks that unfolded on American soil. The Afghanistan campaign is succeeding. His approval rating is almost 90%. The nation is still unified in grief and resolve. But Bush and his speechwriters have something bigger planned than a progress report. They're about to expand the war on terror from the caves of Afghanistan to an entirely new theater. Bush's voice is steady as he names three countries: North Korea, Iran, and Iraq. Then he delivers the phrase that will reshape American foreign policy, justify a preemptive war, and permanently alter the global geopolitical landscape.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
During the speech, a sustained wave of cheers and applause rolls through the chamber. But within hours, diplomats around the world will realize that George W. Bush has just painted targets on three sovereign nations and made diplomatic resolution infinitely hard. I'm Charles Denyer, and this is Chasing Power, where we break down the moments, the scandals, the battles, and the players that shape American politics, both past and present. Today's episode: the Axis of Evil speech from George W. Bush.
Welcome to Chasing Power, the path to Pennsylvania Avenue, a Charles Denyer Productions podcast.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
The audacity of hope. America, you vindicated that hope.
And we will make America great again.
So, to understand why axis of evil became one of the most controversial phrases in modern presidential rhetoric, you need to know three things. First, the phrase was deliberately designed to cast the post-9/11 era as a new global struggle between good and evil. David Frum, a Canadian-born speechwriter, was asked to find a way to link Iraq to the war on terror for the upcoming State of the Union. His first draft used axis of hatred to group Iraq with Iran and North Korea. Chief speechwriter Michael Gerson changed hatred to evil, a word with profound moral and religious connotations that Bush, a born-again Christian, used frequently. The final phrase invoked the Axis powers of World War II, Germany, Italy, and Japan, suggesting that these three nations represented a comparable existential threat to civilization. It was brilliant rhetoric, yet also highly controversial diplomacy. The phrase wasn't based on any actual alliance between the three countries. In fact, Iran and Iraq had fought a brutal 8-year war in the 1980s and despised each other. And North Korea had no meaningful relationship with either Middle Eastern nation. But grouping them together served Bush's larger purpose, expanding the war on terror beyond al-Qaeda to include any state the administration deemed threatening. Second, each of these countries had troubled histories with the United States, but none had direct involvement in 9/11. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, had invaded Kuwait in 1990, leading to the first Gulf War, and spent the 1990s playing cat and mouse with UN weapons inspectors, while the U.S. enforced no-fly zones and sanctions. Iran's Islamic Republic had held American hostages between 1979 and 1981, sponsored Hezbollah and other militant groups, and was pursuing nuclear technology in ways that worried Western intelligence. And as for North Korea, the last Stalinist state, it had developed nuclear weapons capabilities in the late 1990s, sold missiles to other countries, and engaged in periodic provocations against South Korea. These were genuinely problematic regimes, no question about it. But the 9/11 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE, countries Bush did not name. Al-Qaeda operated from Afghanistan and Pakistan, only one of which the U.S. had invaded. The disconnect between the 9/11 perpetrators and the axis of evil was obvious to anyone paying attention. But in early 2002, few Americans were questioning President Bush's framing. Third, the speech came at a moment when Bush had maximum political capital and minimal opposition. Congress had given him sweeping authority to use military force. The media was largely uncritical, even cheerleading. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for aggressive action against terrorism. Bush's inner circle, Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, and the neoconservatives who long advocated regime change in Iraq saw a gigantic opening to pursue a much broader agenda than simply hunting down al-Qaeda. The Axis of Evil speech was the opening salvo in a strategy that would justify preemptive war, regime change, and nation building as tools of counterterrorism. Colin Powell, the Secretary of State and the administration's most prominent moderate voice, had real concerns about the language, but he was overruled. Now, here's what happened. January 29th, 2002. It's just past 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and the President of the United States, George W. Bush, has been speaking for about 35 minutes. He's covered the domestic agenda, education, healthcare, tax cuts. He's praised the success in Afghanistan, where the Taliban has been routed and al-Qaeda is on the run. His voice softens as he speaks of the countless senseless loss of lives and the grief of a young boy.
At a memorial in New York, a little boy left his football with a note for his lost father. "Dear Daddy, please take this to heaven. I don't want to play football until I can play with you again someday."
However, his voice grows stern as he pivots to the core of his message, unfinished business. He warns of terrorist groups seeking weapons of mass destruction, and one by one singles out North Korea, Iran, and then Iraq.
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade.
Then comes the defining moment of Bush's first ever State of the Union address to the nation, and arguably the most defining moment of his entire presidency.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Throughout the speech, the Republican side of the chamber is applauding. Democrats, many of whom supported Afghanistan, look more uncertain, but most join the standing ovation. The cameras capture faces of agreement, resolve, and determination. Some of the Joint Chiefs look stoic, perhaps uncomfortable. Colin Powell's expression is carefully neutral. Bush continues to drive home his point.
By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger. They could provide these arms to terrorists, giving them the means to match their hatred.
The phrase axis of evil instantly dominates the news coverage. Networks replay it dozens of times. Newspaper headlines blasted across front pages. Within 24 hours, diplomats in Tehran, Pyongyang, and Baghdad are scrambling to respond. America's European allies express concern at the aggressive rhetoric. Russia and China, both of which have relationships with the named countries, privately warn that Bush is making diplomacy impossible. But here's what makes this moment so consequential. Bush was not just describing a threat. He was creating a policy framework that made war with at least one of these countries nearly inevitable, regardless of whether they pose an actual imminent danger to the United States. So the global reaction is swift and divided. American conservatives and much of the public embrace the moral clarity of axis of evil. It's simple, it's memorable, and casts complex geopolitical problems in terms of good versus evil that resonate in a new post-9/11 world. Critics, including many foreign policy experts, warn that grouping three unrelated countries together will become a self-fulfilling prophecy, pushing them towards cooperation and making each actually more dangerous. Within weeks, Iran's reformist president Mohammad Khatami, who had been cautiously improving relations with the West, condemns the speech and sees his position weakened against hardliners. North Korea responds by ramping up its nuclear program and withdrawing from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in January 2003. Iraq's Saddam Hussein, already under sanctions and international isolation, becomes even more defiant. Moderate voices in all three countries who might have advocated engagement with the U.S. are now sidelined. The phrase poisons diplomatic channels and makes negotiated solutions vastly more difficult. Meanwhile, the Bush administration begins building the case for war with Iraq, specifically using the axis of evil framework to suggest Iraq is part of a broader terrorist threat. The axis of evil speech becomes the intellectual foundation for what will be called the Bush Doctrine, the principle that the United States can and should use preemptive military force against potential threats before they materialize. In October 2002, Congress passes the Iraq resolution authorizing military force, with many Democrats supporting it based on claims about weapons of mass destruction and terrorist ties that flow directly from the axis of evil framing. On March 20th, 2003, the United States invades Iraq. The war's justification ultimately proves false. There are no weapons of mass destruction, no operational links to al-Qaeda, and no imminent threat. The occupation becomes a disaster. Over 4,400 U.S. troops killed, more than 32,000 wounded, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians dead, and a power vacuum that eventually spawns ISIS. The war costs over $2 to $3 trillion and destroys Bush's credibility. By his second term, Axis of Evil has transformed from a rallying cry into an albatross, shorthand for the hubris and deception that led America into its worst foreign policy disaster since Vietnam. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The two countries Bush did not invade became far more dangerous than the one he did. The Axis of Evil speech's real legacy is the law of unintended consequences writ large. Iraq, the country Bush ultimately invaded, didn't have weapons of mass destruction and posed no imminent threat, but the invasion destabilized the entire Middle East, strengthened Iran's regional position, created millions of refugees, and cost trillions of dollars while achieving none of its stated objectives. North Korea, named in the speech but never attacked, interpreted the Iraq invasion as proof that only nuclear weapons could deter American aggression. So they accelerated their program, conducting 6 nuclear tests between 2006 and 2017, and developing ICBMs capable of potentially reaching the U.S. mainland. Iran, also named but not invaded, drew the same lesson and expanded its nuclear enrichment program, moving closer to weapons capability while increasing support for proxy forces across the region. The phrase that was meant to isolate and intimidate these regimes instead gave them a shared identity, validated their paranoia about American intentions, and incentivized the exact behavior President Bush claimed he wanted to prevent. Diplomats and historians now cite Axis of Evil as a textbook example of how rhetoric can constrain policy options and make problems even worse. Compare this to today. North Korea is a nuclear-armed state. Iran is closer to a bomb than it was in 2002, and Iraq remains unstable with significant Iranian influence. The problems the Axis of Evil speech were supposed to solve have all gotten worse, at a cost of trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives. Now, defenders of Bush's Axis of Evil speech make several arguments worth considering. They contend that all three countries genuinely were pursuing dangerous weapons programs and supporting terrorism, making them legitimate subjects of presidential concern regardless of their connection to 9/11. They note that moral clarity in leadership isn't a vice, that calling evil by its name and drawing clear lines between acceptable and unacceptable behavior is part of presidential responsibility, especially in wartime. Some argue, and this is very important to note, and a point that I do agree with, and it's that North Korea and Iran's subsequent nuclear advances would have happened anyway regardless of Bush's rhetoric, given their long-standing programs and strategic calculations. Supporters also point out that Saddam Hussein's regime was genuinely brutal, had used chemical weapons against the Kurds and Iran, and had defied UN resolutions for a decade, making regime change a defensible goal, even if weapons of mass destruction intelligence were dead wrong. They also note that Bush's post-9/11 doctrine, that America cannot wait for threats to fully materialize before acting, reflected a genuine recalibration of risk tolerance after 3,000 Americans died in a single morning. To be fair, presidential rhetoric has always combined moral judgment with strategic interest, and condemning hostile regimes pursuing weapons of mass destruction, well, that wasn't unreasonable in early 2002. David Frum, the speechwriter who coined the phrase that became axis of evil, later expressed deep ambivalence about his creation. In his 2003 memoir, he defended the concept but acknowledged that the phrase had hardened the lines and made diplomacy more difficult. By the time the Iraq War was revealed as a disaster built on false intelligence, Frum's phrase had become infamous, a symbol of the neoconservative overreach that defined Bush's foreign policy. In 2022, 20 years after the speech, all three countries named in the axis of evil were still hostile to the United States, still pursuing weapons programs, and still cited as major national security concerns, suggesting that President Bush's attempt to cow them into submission through rhetoric and force had simply not worked. Sometimes the most memorable phrases in presidential speeches are memorable for all the wrong reasons. Axis of evil did not eliminate the threats that Bush identified. It ensured they'd be around for decades to come. I'm Charles Denyer. Thanks for chasing power with me.
All opinions expressed are those of the host and do not reflect the official positions of any political organization, government agency, or private institution. This podcast is for news reporting, commentary, and criticism. We use excerpts, clips, and quotations from political events and other copyrighted works under the Fair Use Doctrine. All rights in those works remain with their respective owners. The views expressed are our own and do not represent any other entity.